It was the fall of 1998 at the legendary Apollo Theater in Harlem, a night thick with history, soul, and the kind of buzzing anticipation that made every heartbeat feel amplified beneath the golden lights. Stevie Wonder stood center stage, soaking in the electricity of a crowd that filled every inch of the room. Tourists, locals, elders who had seen legends rise, and kids who had grown up hearing their parents whisper stories about the Apollo's magic. The band had just finished warming up when Stevie paused, lifting his head slightly as though tuning into a frequency no one else could hear. The audience sensed it immediately. Conversations stilled, applause softened, and the air tightened with expectation, as if the theater itself knew that something unscripted was about to unfold. Stevie's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, the kind he wore whenever intuition brushed against his spirit, guiding him toward a moment no rehearsal could prepare for. Just outside, the stage door before the show, a 15-year-old street musician named Darius Cole had been playing his battered acoustic guitar for passing crowds, his voice rising over the noise of Harlem traffic with a grit beyond his years. Life in the Lenox Avenue projects had taught him to be loud enough to be heard, tough enough to keep going, and creative enough to survive days when talent felt like his only shield. He had no ticket for the show, he couldn't afford one, but he lingered near the back entrance anyway, hoping to catch a faint echo of the music, or maybe a glimpse of the man whose songs had helped him escape the chaos of his neighborhood. What Darius didn't know was that one of the stagehands had heard him earlier that evening, a grown man brought to stillness by the haunting rasp of a boy singing the blues, like he was born with the echo of decades in his voice. As Stevie paused on stage, that same stagehand slipped up beside him and whispered, "There's a kid out back singing like the sidewalk is his stage." Stevie chuckled, intrigued, his head tilting once more, as if listening to something only his soul could detect. Then, without warning, he raised his hand to silence the band and turned toward the wings. "Bring him in," Stevie said calmly, as though asking for a cup of tea instead of rewriting the night's entire performance. Gasps erupted from the first few rows. The band exchanged startled glances. Stagehands scrambled toward the back entrance, and somewhere outside, Darius, tired, unnoticed, and clutching his chipped guitar like a lifeline, was about to be pulled into a moment that would alter the entire direction of his life. The Apollo Theater had hosted countless legends, but tonight it was about to witness the birth of a story no audience would ever forget. Darius didn't understand what was happening when two stagehands rushed out the back door, calling his name like they had been looking for him all night. He froze with his guitar still strapped across his chest, fingers hovering over the strings mid-chord. "Kid, come with us," one of the men said, breathless and wide-eyed. "Stevie wants you inside." The words hit Darius so hard he nearly dropped his guitar. He looked around as if expecting someone to laugh, to tell him it was a mistake, to explain that they meant some other kid, someone trained, someone polished, someone who actually belonged in a place like the Apollo. But the men urged him forward, and before he could think, his feet were moving, carrying him through the stage door and into a world he had only ever imagined from the outside. His heart slammed against his ribs, every step echoing through the narrow hallway like a countdown to something impossible. As he was led toward the stage, Darius's breath came out in sharp, unsteady bursts. The backstage world blurred past him, coils of cables, glowing monitors, musicians whispering in shock, dancers frozen. Mid-prep, as they watched the skinny teenager with the battered guitar pass by, he clutched the neck of his instrument so tightly his knuckles burned. Everything inside him screamed that he should turn around, run back to the street where he understood the rules, where no one expected him to be extraordinary. But something else tugged at him too, something quieter, buried deep beneath years of surviving instead of thriving. A feeling that whispered, "What if you're not here by accident?" The closer he got to the stage, the louder that whisper grew, until it felt like a heartbeat pushing him forward. When Darius reached the wings, Stevie was already waiting for him, standing in a soft halo of stage lights that painted his silhouette in gold. The crowd buzzed in confusion, their murmurs rising like static through the darkened theater. Stevie stepped toward Darius with a steady smile, extending a hand that radiated warmth even before their palms met. "Brother Darius," Stevie said, speaking his name with a familiarity that sent chills through the boy's spine. "I hear you've been singing to the streets tonight." Darius swallowed hard, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. Stevie nodded toward the stage, lifting his chin with quiet encouragement. "How about you sing to Harlem instead?" The band stared, stunned. The audience fell into a hush, and as Darius took a single shaking step onto the legendary Apollo stage, he crossed an invisible line, leaving behind the world he came from and stepping into the moment that would decide who he could become. The moment Darius stepped into the glow of the Apollo stage lights, the theater fell under a hush so deep it felt almost supernatural. He squinted against the brightness, the weight of hundreds, no thousands, of eyes settling on him like a tidal wave he wasn't ready for. His heartbeat rattled through his chest, loud enough that he wondered if the microphones might pick it up. The guitar strap dug into his shoulder, reminding him this wasn't a dream or a hallucination. This was happening. He stood frozen in the center of the stage, shoulders tense, fingers curled tightly around the neck of his bruised guitar. For a terrifying moment, he felt like a kid, completely out of place, an intruder in a world built for legends. But then he sensed Stevie beside him, not crowding him, not overshadowing him, simply standing there like a steady flame, offering warmth in the coldness of uncertainty. Stevie turned to face the audience, lifting his hand in a gesture that quieted even the whispers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice flowing through the theater with the ease and authority of someone who had shaped music history, "we're gonna do something a little different tonight." Laughter rippled softly through the room, but it wasn't mocking. It was curious, charged with anticipation. Stevie motioned toward Darius, his smile gentle and proud. "This young brother's been playing out on the street, pouring soul into the sidewalk." The crowd murmured, shifting with interest. "So I figured," Stevie continued. "If he can sing to concrete and cold air, he can surely start a song up here with us." Gasps spread across the theater. Some people leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes shining. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But everyone understood one thing. They were about to witness something unscripted, unpredictable, and potentially magical. Stevie stepped back, giving Darius all the space he needed. He didn't offer instructions, didn't tell him what to play. He trusted the boy fully, in a way that startled Darius to his core. The band stayed frozen behind their instruments, eyes wide, hands hovering but motionless. No one knew what key the boy would choose. No one knew what tempo he'd set. No one knew what emotion would guide his fingers. The entire Apollo Theater felt suspended in a single breath as Darius adjusted the guitar against his chest. His fingers twitched over the strings, trembling with fear and adrenaline. He could feel the room waiting, not pressuring, not judging, but waiting. Then he remembered the nights he played on the corner, the strangers who paused to listen, the coins dropped into his open case, the way music made the world feel less heavy. He closed his eyes, inhaled slowly, and lifted his pick. With one decisive strum, raw and soulful, he broke the silence, and the moment instantly caught fire. The first chord Darius struck wasn't perfect. It buzzed slightly at the edges, the sound of worn strings under nervous fingers, but it was real, raw, and drenched in a kind of street-forged soul that hit the audience like a shockwave. The vibration rolled across the theater in a warm, gritty wave, echoing off the historic walls like they had been waiting decades for a chord exactly like it. The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped, others murmured, a few whispered, "Oh my God," under their breaths. But no one moved. No one dared break the fragile electric thread that bound Darius's trembling hands to the legendary room surrounding him. With his eyes still closed, he adjusted his grip, took a shaky breath, and strummed again. This time cleaner, fuller, the sound blooming outward with the unmistakable signature of someone who had learned music not from teachers, but from survival. Stevie tilted his head, a smile slowly spreading across his face as he recognized the melody Darius was hinting hinting toward. A blues progression that wasn't flashy or polished, but potent, soaked in emotion, shaped by nights spent singing into the cold air of Harlem streets. He didn't interrupt. He didn't guide. He simply let the boy take control, his presence a silent vote of confidence. Behind them, the band shifted in their seats, stunned by the tone rising from the teenager's battered guitar. The pianist's eyebrows shot upward as he mouthed a quiet, "Lord, have mercy." The drummer leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring like he had forgotten he was part of the show. Even the horn section stilled, their instruments glinting under the lights, as they listened to a kid whose music carried more truth than half the charts they had played that year. When Darius began to sing, the entire Apollo Theater transformed. His voice wasn't clean or polished. It was rough in the best way, cracked at the edges, thick, with gravel and youth and pain and beauty all tangled together. It was the kind of voice you didn't expect from a 15-year-old, the kind of voice that sounded like it had lived 3 lifetimes already. As the first line spilled out of him, a woman in the third row clapped her hand over her mouth, tears springing instantly to her eyes. A man near the balcony whispered, "That's blues, baby." Stevie took one slow step back, giving Darius the full spotlight, watching with awe as the boy's voice climbed higher, stronger, weaving through the air like smoke rising from a burning match. The band remained frozen, unable to look away, their silence louder than any instrument they could have played. And in that quiet, reverent stillness, the Apollo crowd realized they weren't just watching a moment, they were witnessing the birth of an artist. The second line Darius sang rolled through the Apollo like thunder wrapped in velvet, a sound so unexpected and powerful that the audience reacted in a way no one could have predicted. People didn't just listen, they felt it. His voice cracked once, but the crack wasn't a flaw. It was truth. It was experience. It was the sound of a kid who had known hardship and grit and still found a way to pour beauty through the fractures. A wave of murmurs swept through the theater. Folks leaned forward, hands gripping armrests, eyes widening as if trying to understand how someone so young could carry so much weight in his voice. Darius's foot tapped nervously against the stage, but the rhythm that came out of him was steady, instinctive, shaped by the hundreds of nights he had performed for strangers who rarely looked him in the eye. Now, an entire theater hung on every note. Stevie stood just behind Darius, his arms folded loosely, his face softened into a smile that held equal parts pride and astonishment. The expression on his face said everything. This boy isn't good. He's extraordinary. Stevie had shared stages with legends, icons, giants of music, but in that moment, he looked like a man witnessing something fresh, something rare, something pure. He didn't join in. He didn't sing over the boy. Instead, he tilted his head back and let the music wash over him, allowing Darius to command the room on his own terms. Behind them, the band was still completely frozen, unable to move or even prepare to back him up. They were musicians trained to follow cues, but no one had cued them for this. No one had expected a street kid to step onto the most iconic stage in Harlem and drop a vocal so raw it left professionals stunned into silence. As Darius pushed into the chorus, something shifted in the crowd. A release, a surrender. People who had been holding their breath finally exhaled, some letting out quiet cries, others whispering prayers of gratitude for being alive at the right moment to witness this. The guitar hummed under his fingertips, imperfect but honest, the strings buzzing in a way that made the performance feel even more human. Darius's voice swelled, bending with emotion, scraping at the edges of pain and hope, just the way blues was meant to sound. When he hit the final note of the phrase, it soared higher than it had any right to, trembling in the air before dissolving into silence. And in that silence, thick, breathless, holy, the audience waited, stunned, suspended in awe, right before the entire theater erupted into a noise so wild and explosive it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. The eruption that followed was unlike anything the Apollo Theater had felt in years. It didn't start as applause. It started as an explosion, a raw, uncontrollable outcry of disbelief that ripped out of the audience in a single, stunned wave. People leapt from their seats as if pulled upward by the force of Darius's final note. Shouts burst from the balcony, screams echoed from the aisles. Some audience members slapped the backs of their seats with open palms, unable to contain themselves. Others threw their hands into the air, shaking their heads wildly as if trying to process what they had just heard. The reaction wasn't polite, it wasn't measured, it was instinctual, an eruption of pure shock and joy at witnessing a kid from the streets deliver a performance that felt like it had been carved straight from the heart of Harlem's musical soul. Darius stumbled back at the intensity of it all, his breath uncatching as he tried to understand why thousands of people were losing their minds over him. Stevie stepped forward immediately, placing a steadying hand on Darius's shoulder as the boy fought to remain upright under the avalanche of applause. "Easy, brother," Stevie murmured with a smile that radiated pride and warmth. "You just set this place on fire." Darius stared at him, chest heaving, eyes wide and overwhelmed. He felt like he was floating, like the stage beneath him had turned to air. For a moment he thought he might cry, or fall, or simply disappear from the weight of the moment pressing into him from every direction. But Stevie kept his hand there, grounding him, guiding him back into himself. Behind them, the band members finally snapped out of their stunned trance. The drummer let out a long whistle. The bassist shook his head, laughing in disbelief. The pianist covered his face with both hands. They had seen prodigies, professionals, legends, but they had never seen a street kid walk in cold and bring the Apollo to its knees in under 60 seconds. The noise only grew louder. The audience pounded the floor with their feet, clapped until their palms stung, shouted praise into the rafters as though trying to etch the moment into the walls of the theater forever. Some people were crying openly, tears sliding down cheeks as if they were witnessing something spiritual. Others simply laughed in shock, unable to believe the power that had just come from a 15-year-old boy who hadn't even known he'd be on stage tonight. Darius felt the heat of the lights, the weight of the applause, the pulse of the room vibrating through him like a second heartbeat. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a kid singing to survive. He felt like an artist, one worthy of the spotlight he never imagined he'd touch. Stevie gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, whispering, "They hear you now. The whole world does," as the explosive cheers slowly softened into a warm, rolling thunder. Stevie raised both hands gently, signaling the crowd to let the moment breathe. The audience obeyed, not out of obligation, but out of reverence, easing into a hush that shimmered with awe. Darius stood in the center of the stage, shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths, eyes wide with disbelief as the adrenaline rushed through him like a current he couldn't control. His hands shook so violently he had to grip the guitar to keep it steady. But beneath the trembling, something new flickered inside him, something fierce, something bright, something that felt suspiciously like pride. He dared to lift his chin just a little, and the crowd responded with another soft wave of applause that washed over him like a blessing. For the first time in his life, Darius didn't feel like a kid fighting to be heard. He felt like someone worth listening to. Stevie stepped beside him, turning toward the audience with a look of pure joy etched across his face. "Now that," he said, his voice booming through the theater, "is what happens when you let the streets sing." The crowd erupted again, not the wild explosion from before, but a deep, unified roar filled with respect. Stevie rested a hand on Darius's back and added, "This brother didn't come here tonight expecting a stage, but greatness doesn't wait for invitations." The words drifted through the Apollo like truth carried on a melody. Darius swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure as he felt the emotional weight of Stevie's praise settle into his chest. Even the band members stood with softened expressions, their earlier shock replaced by admiration. It wasn't just that they respected him, they recognized him, they saw him, and that alone made Darius's throat tighten with overwhelming gratitude. Stevie then took Darius gently by the wrist and lifted his arm into the air as though presenting a champion. The theater rose again in a sweeping ovation that seemed to shake the very bones of the building. Darius closed his eyes as tears finally spilled down his cheeks, not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from the undeniable realization that something inside him had shifted forever. The noise around him blurred into a single powerful swell as Stevie whispered close to his ear, "This world is bigger than the sidewalk, brother, and your voice belongs everywhere." Darius nodded, unable to speak, gripping the neck of his guitar with trembling fingers as he faced the roaring crowd. At that moment he knew the truth. He would never return to the streets the same boy he had been hours before. He had stepped into a legend spotlight and discovered that he had a light of his own. Long after the lights dimmed and the crowd poured out into the Harlem night, the echo of Darius's voice lingered inside the Apollo like a ghost made of melody and grit. Stage hands moved slowly, almost reverently, as though unwilling to break the spell the boy had cast over the room. The band packed their instruments in silence, exchanging glances that said more than words could. Glances filled with disbelief, gratitude, and the certainty that they had witnessed something once in a generation. Even Stevie lingered by the edge of the stage, his fingers tracing the smooth curve of his keyboard as if replaying the moment in his mind. He didn't need sight to remember Darius. He felt the boy's sound ringing through his chest, raw and fearless, the kind of voice that couldn't be taught or polished, only revealed in the right moment. Outside, under the cool glow of the streetlights, Darius sat on the steps of the Apollo, his battered guitar resting across his lap. The night air felt different now, lighter, warmer, humming with a quiet magic that made the city seem alive in a way he had never noticed before. He replayed the moment in his head, Stevie calling his name, the blinding lights, the stunned silence, the eruption of cheers. It didn't feel real, and yet every tremble in his hands, every quickened heartbeat reminded him that it was. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a kid singing against the noise of the world. He felt like someone with a future, someone whose voice mattered not because of where he came from, but because of what lived inside him. And back inside the theater, Stevie smiled as he listened to the distant hum of the city, sensing the boy's presence just beyond the doors. "He's gonna be all right," he whispered to himself, because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one spotlight, one note, one unexpected act of faith to pull someone out of the shadows and into the place they were meant to stand. That night at the Apollo, Stevie Wonder didn't just share his stage, he opened a door, and when Darius Cole stepped through it, the world finally heard a voice that had been singing on Harlem sidewalks for years, waiting for the right moment to rise.